At 20, she was given, still untouched, to a rich baron no one dared approach. What happened shocked all. Black Ridge, Colorado Territory, late autumn, 1889. The sun sank low behind the jagged peaks of the Sweetwater Mountains, painting the sky in bruised gold and rose. Dust rose from the churned earth of the dusty main street, twisting in the wind and mingling with the smell of sweat and stale whiskey. A few wagons creaked, horses stamped, and the murmured hush of townsfolk drifted in the air, like restless ghosts. At the far end of the road stood Eleanor Wade, 20 years old, her brown hair limp and dusty, cheeks pale as milk. She hovered behind her uncle, Amos Wade, whose shoulders slumped and eyes red-rimmed from drink. His clothes hung loose, stained, and his boots were caked with mud. Eleanor's hands dropped at her sides, her gaze flicked between the crowd and the man in black standing before them. Amos cleared his throat and raised his voice over the quieting crowd. "She is 20 years old, untouched, pure, more valuable than my debts to you. I want more gold." His words cut through the warm afternoon light, heavy as chains. A ripple passed through the gathered townsfolk. Some lowered their eyes, others swallowed hard. A soft whisper drifted, "Poor girl, she won't survive the winter." The man in the long black coat stood in silhouette beneath the dying Sunday Silas Vane, known by many as Baron Stone, watched with his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Only his hand moved, extending a heavy pouch of gold toward Amos. He made no gesture beyond that, no smile, no nod. The pouch glinted in the last light. Amos stepped forward and pushed Eleanor gently. She staggered. There was no plea, no resistance, only a hollow ache in her chest. She felt every eye on her, and she lumped forward as though pulled by some grim rope. The people remained still, too afraid or too ashamed to interrupt. "Go," Amos muttered, voice rough. Eleanor climbed into the wagon behind the seat, her fingers clutching the wood. The wheels groaned as the horses strained forward. The town's simple wooden buildings slipped by in fading gold and shadows. No one followed. No one spoke for her. Tears sprung unchecked in her eyes. The wind whipped them dry before they fell, cutting tracks in her cheeks. The wagon jolted, and she glanced back over her shoulder at the faces in the street. Some bowed their heads. One old woman pressed a hand to her lips and wept. A child stared with uncovered mouth. Silas mounted his horse and turned away, leading his steed backward toward the wagon's front. He let the horses draw them away. The sun dropped below the horizon, and the town's lights flickered on in welcome or resignation. Eleanor could not tell which. She sat silent, trembling. The wind tugged at her cloak. The last sheet of gold evaporated from the sky, leaving bruised twilight in its wake. The wagon rolled out of town under muttered prayers and stifled sobs. There was no wedding, no blessing, only that moment. She, traded for gold, handed over as though she were a debt paid, not a human being. And as the wheels creaked on the road into darkness, Eleanor bowed her head and wept, feeling more alone than she ever had. The first chapter of her life, beyond the little town of Redwood Creek, had begun under the weight of sorrow and the edge of shame. The world lightened only faintly as Eleanor and the wagon crested the final rise. Before her stood Black Ridge Manor, a castle of gray stone perched atop the hill. The stones were weathered, streaked with moss and lichen. Vines crawled over crenellations. Windows were dark like empty eye sockets. It looked ancient, abandoned, haunted by its own silence. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on gravel. He helped Eleanor down. She brushed dust from her skirt with trembling fingers. He led her through a heavy iron gate into a courtyard ringed by columns. The wind whistled through archways. Pigeons fluttered and scattered with startled coos. Inside, the halls were cavernous. She felt swallowed by shadows. The ceilings vaulted high overhead, and tapestries hung, faded and moth-eaten. The floor was stone, cold beneath her slippers. Doors stood ajar, but every room she peeked into was empty. No furniture, no flicker of candle, no warmth. A chandelier cast long, skeletal shadows. the silence pressed around her like long fingers. Silas guided her to a smaller chamber hidden off a corridor. A modest hearth, a narrow bed, a small table. He placed before her a tray, a crust of bread, a bowl of broth, a cup of warm water. He paused, looking down at her. Then he turned and walked away, vanishing into the gloom without a word. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the tray. The bread looked hard, the broth lukewarm. Her stomach churned with fear, not hunger. She did not touch a morsel. Her gaze lifted to the door. Had he meant kindness, or was this another form of control? The rumors echoed in her mind. They say he killed his wife. They say he hides corpses in these walls. She heard the wind rattling shuttered windows. Her heart pounded. Behind her, footsteps receded. Then only silence remained. Eleanor pressed her palms to her eyes and fought tears, trying to steady her breathing. Her skin prickled with the need to escape. Night fell hard, darkness pressing at the window panes. The manor creaked and groaned with every breath of wind. She lay in the bed, but sleep offered no comfort. The shadows moved just beyond vision. She thought she heard voices in distant hallways. She thought she saw a figure vanish around a corner. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Finally she rose. She donned her cloak and slipped quietly toward the door. She crept down corridors, her candle stub extinguished, ears stretched. She found the stables at the far wing, open barn doors, horses shifting, the hint of moonlight through slats. Her fingers trembling, she lifted the latch, stepped into the cold air, and found her horse saddled. She drew herself up onto its back, the animal snorting in surprise. She nudged it forward, silent, urgent. But before she truly fled, a figure appeared in the stable doorway. Silas, framed by pale light, tall and still. He did not shout or seize her. His voice was soft but firm. "Want to go? Eat first, then go." He turned and walked away, back toward the manor, shoulders squared. He made no move to block her, no shout to stop her, no order to stay. He merely walked away. Eleanor froze, horse between her legs, her chest convulsed. On the verge of flight, she hesitated. The distance between them felt both small and infinite. Could she run? Or would running bring her to worse danger? She slid from the saddle, startled by her own trembling. With uncertain steps, she led the horse back along shadowed paths to the stable, nodded once, and closed the door behind them. She waited in silence, heart beating like thunder, staring at the walls of the manor rising above her. In that moment, for the first time, she wondered if this place was a prison or protection. Maybe it isn't what I feared. And so she turned away from escape, swallowed by the hush of stone corridors, wondering which truth she would dare trust. In the days that followed, Eleanor navigated her new life at Blackridge with trembling caution. Silas never once brought up her flight attempt. He moved through halls of stone like a ghost, and yet his presence began to manifest in small, hushed ways. One dawn, Eleanor rose before the Sunday. She crept to the door and found, lying on a simple wooden slab, a loaf of bread still warm, split in two, and a small bowl of porridge. No note. She stared at it, heart thumping, then dared to take a bite. The warmth was unfamiliar on her tongue. Later, when she dressed in a faded gown, she discovered a subtle repair to a seam that had torn from rough use. The stitches were neat, the thread matching perfectly. She pressed a fingertip to the line, astonished. In the study she found a cup of tea half full, steam lazily curling upward as though freshly poured. Eleanor remained wary. Each gesture unsettled her, too kind, too incongruous with the rumors she had heard of Silas. But the consistency of them unsettled her defenses. These were not one-off acts, they were a pattern. One afternoon, she wandered through the manor's library, its tall shelves blanketed in dust. As she pulled a heavy volume, a floorboard shifted. Behind the shelf lay a narrow seam in the wall. Her breath caught. She searched the nearby desk drawers, eventually discovering a small brass key tucked beneath a false bottom. With shaking fingers, she unlocked the hidden door. Beyond it lay a modest chamber cloaked in silence, Dust motes drifted in shafts of dying light. A carved wooden box in the center bore a name etched in faded letters, Mara. Eleanor knelt and opened the box. Inside lay a locket, a scarf, and a leather journal. The journal's cover bore Mara Vane's name. With great care, Eleanor turned pages, reading passages in delicate handwriting. Moments of hope, of love, laughter in summer meadows, evenings by firelight, and shadows of dread. Nights Mara felt alone, watching dark halls, fearing betrayal. One entry cut through Eleanor's heart. He promised to protect me, but I died waiting for him to come home. Tears blurred her vision. The grief in Mara's words echoed in Eleanor's own trembling soul. She sank to the floor, pressing her back to cold stone, journal pressed to her chest. The walls, once cold and unwelcoming, felt charged with memory and sorrow. She understood then that Silas was not the monster of rumor. He was a man carrying a wounded heart. When she rose to leave, she brushed her fingers over the box, whispering, "I see you." She closed the journal and replaced the lid so gently it made no sound. She locked the door behind her and slipped the key into her pocket. In the corridor, her footsteps echoed. The manor no longer felt lifeless. She moved past tapestries and portraits, perceiving now the weight of loss that draped them all. The hush was different, less oppressive, more expectant. Outside the hidden room, lanterns glowed in the distant hall. Eleanor paused, heart throbbing. She thought of Mara, of Silas, of the gestures that had seemed small and now felt monumental. She wondered if she could belong in that place, not as a transaction, but as someone seen and understood. A gentle wind stirred the windows. She stepped into the hallway and closed her eyes, letting the silence settle around her. In that quiet, she felt a tremor of possibility, that broken souls might find solace, that wounds might not forever dictate fate. And though fear still clung to her skin, Eleanor felt a fragile resolve form in her chest. She would watch, she would wait, she would not assume cruelty, she would listen for gentleness. The manor's walls, silent as stones, had begun to speak. The snow came suddenly. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned to slate, and the wind howled down from the mountains like a warning. Silas worked in silence to board windows, while Eleanor hauled what firewood she could to the hearth. The storm's breath pressed against the stone walls of Blackridge like an unseen beast, cold seeping into every crack. Eleanor had just returned from the cellar, arms full of kindling, when her boots slipped on the slick floor. She crashed hard, her head striking the edge of the doorway. Dazed, she sat up, waved off Silas's offered hand, and forced a smile. "I'm fine," she muttered, but her voice was shaky. By nightfall, she was not fine. The fever crept in slowly, coiling through her limbs, fogging her mind. Her breaths turned shallow. She tried to sit up, to fetch water, but her body betrayed her. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the shadow of Silas standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. Then came only fragments: damp cloth on her forehead, warm broth at her lips, a calloused hand brushing the hair from her eyes. "Drink," his voice, barely above a whisper. "You need to stay." The fever raged. In her delirium she saw flickers of fire, heard cries from her past, the cruel jeers of her uncle. She flinched, crying out, and a hand caught hers. "I am not him," the voice said again, firmer now. "You are safe." She did not know how long the night lasted, only that through every hour of agony she was never alone. Silas remained at her side, never leaving, not even when her limbs thrashed or when she muttered Mara's name without knowing why. When morning broke through the frost-glazed window, Eleanor opened her eyes. The fever had broken. Sunlight stretched in pale ribbons across the stone floor. Her skin felt clammy, her muscles weak, but there was a stillness to her now, a quiet within. She turned her head. Silas sat slumped in the chair beside her bed, chin resting on his chest, eyes closed in exhaustion. His coat had slipped from his shoulders, revealing a shirt wrinkled and damp with sweat. Beside him, on the table, was a basin of water, a bundle of dried herbs, and a half-empty mug of tea. Eleanor looked at her own hand, still resting gently in his. She stared at him for a long time. It would have been easy to call it duty, pity perhaps, but something in the way he slept, still holding on, as if afraid she might vanish, told her otherwise. When she tried to pull her hand away, his fingers tightened slightly in his sleep, as if reflexively refusing to let go. Her chest tightened. Carefully, she sat up, propping herself with trembling arms. On the bedside table, a fresh cloth lay folded, and her blanket had been tucked around her neatly. These were not the actions of a man hardened beyond care. They were the quiet rituals of someone who had known loss, and refused to know it again. She touched her forehead. No sweat, no pain, only warmth. Silas stirred then, eyes blinking open. He met her gaze, and froze. "You stayed," she whispered. He looked at her hand in his, then gently released it. "You needed care," he said simply, voice hoarse. "No one's ever," she faltered, then swallowed. "No one's ever looked after me like that." Silas said nothing. But the way his eyes softened, the slight dip of his head, it said, enough. He stood, adjusted the blanket at her feet, and reached for the tea. "I'll bring more broth," he murmured, then paused. "Rest. I will be close." As he turned to leave, Eleanor's voice followed him. "Thank you, Silas." He stopped, but did not turn back, only nodded once, and disappeared down the hall. Alone, Eleanor lay back against the pillow, her heart still unsteady but not from fever. The walls of Blackridge no longer felt cold. And for the first time since she arrived, she closed her eyes and let herself feel something other than fear. The wind rattled the windows like bones as midnight pressed close. Eleanor lay uneasy in her bed, half awake, uneasy because the manor felt too still. The halls were dark, empty, save for the flicker of an oil lamp in a distant corridor. Suddenly, a harsh noise, wood splintering, tore through the silence. She bolted upright, heart pounding. Before she could understand, rough hands seized her arms, pulling her from the bed. Panic struck like lightning. She tried to scream, but a cold cloth pressed over her mouth muffled the sound. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, hands pulled backward, the ropes cutting into her skin. Fear overwhelmed her. "Please, let me go," she managed to croak. A shape loomed in darkness. The figure dragged her across cold stone floor, toward a door she had never seen open at night. She kicked weakly, fought the bindings, her voice ragged with terror. She could hear her own breath, loud in the quiet, and distant echoes of footsteps. Then a new sound, a boot, steady, deliberate. A silhouette framed by doorway light, a rifle's silhouette. And then the man she feared and hated, Cole Danton, stepping forward with a cruel grin. He had come back. "Baron Vane, I claim my debt," Cole sneered, voice low and dangerous. "Give me the girl and spare your life." Eleanor felt her heart seize. She tried to twist away, tried to shout. Her voice failed. Her vision swam with tears and fear. She watched Cole advance, pistol drawn, his shadow long across the floor. And then he fired. Chaos erupted. A shot cracked the air. Splinters flew. Smoke curled in the lamplight. Silas burst into the room, rifle raised, eyes blazing with fury. He aimed, fired. A bullet splashed against the wall. Cole's sneer flickered. Eleanor screamed behind the gag as the room erupted into violence. Chairs crashed, lamps tipped, shadows danced. Silas advanced, stepping between Cole and Eleanor. Another shot roared. The bullet struck Silas in the shoulder. He gasped, staggered, but he did not fall. He propped himself against the wall, arm outstretched. "Eleanor, behind me!" he roared, voice tight with pain. He leveled his weapon again. Cole sneered, stepping forward as if daring Silas. Another crack of gunfire. Silas wobbled. Blood blossomed on his shirt. Yet he planted his boots, shielded Eleanor with his body. In that moment, Silas's voice, raw, ragged, fierce, broke the gun smoke. "I lost her once. I won't lose you." His words struck Eleanor sharper than any bullet. Tears blurred her view. She could see him bleeding, body trembling but unwavering. He was not the distant, silent lord. He was a man fighting for her life. Cole hesitated. His confidence faltered. He spat curses, but the bravado cracked under Silas's determined glare. More gunshots rang, then the front door burst. Guards of the manor, alerted by the commotion, stormed in. They overpowered Cole, shackled him, and dragged him away. His eyes flicked to Eleanor, burning with defeat. Silas stumbled to her side, leaning heavily on one leg. Eleanor broke free of her bonds in a frenzy, lunged forward, and fell at his side. She wrapped trembling arms around him, pressing her face to his bleeding shoulder cuffs. "Don't die," she whispered, voice trembling. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. He touched her cheek with a shaking hand, brushing away tears. "I promise," he said, voice cracked. "Not this time." Eleanor sobbed, head against his chest. Guards entered, shining lanterns in the smoky room. One after another they knelt to aid Silas, bandage his wound, clear debris. In the aftermath, as the lamplight steadied and dust settled, Eleanor stood beside him. Her eyes met his. In the dim glow, their breath came ragged, bodies trembling. But victory had turned. She saw him clearly, broken, bleeding, fiercely protective, willing to risk all. That night, beneath the ruins of terror, Eleanor's fear began to solidify into something else: awe, trust, love. And Silas, scarred yet unbowed, stood as her shield, declaring silently that he would never let her go. Word spread through the valleys and over dusty roads. They said a girl had been traded up the hill for gold, that the Baron had taken her to his stone fortress, that she must be captive. Rumors blossomed in every saloon, from Dustridge to Redwater Creek. Early one morning, the first wagons creaked up the ridge. Farmers, curious folks, preachers, and a few armed men arrived at Black Ridge gates. They whispered among themselves, glancing at the imposing manor walls, speculation painted on their faces. They believed they must save the girl. The main courtyard filled. The townsfolk, from rugged cowhands to delicate ladies in muffled shawls, watched with narrowed eyes and folded arms. Some muttered, "She must be freed," others said, "A poor creature held by a monster." Silas stood at the top of the staircase leading from the manor's grand doors. Eleanor appeared behind him, dressed simply, hair brushed back, face pale but steady in resolve. She stepped forward, placing herself before the crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear, though softly tinged with a tremor. "I was given away, but now I choose to stay." A hush fell. The wind died. Even distant cattle were silent. Eleanor held out her hand to Silas. He caught it. Their fingers interlocked. No dramatic gesture, no flourish of cloak. But their eyes met, and in those eyes lay a truth that defied rumors. She looked at the gathered faces. She saw the astonishment. She saw the pity that once glittered in their gazes dim. But she also saw hesitation. She inhaled, standing taller. "I will not leave because I live in fear. I will stay because I have found something worth staying for." She turned her gaze to Silas beside her. Their clasped hands spoke more than words ever could. The people watched. The wife of the blacksmith gasped. The banker's daughter gasped. Hardened ranchers fidgeted. In that moment the shift came. One by one, heads bowed. Not in mockery, not in pity, but in respect. The quiet acceptance of her, not as a captive, but as a woman making a choice. The preacher cleared his throat, stepping forward. He lowered his hat. Others followed. The man who had sworn she was a debt to be collected now looked at her as though seeing a person for the first time. The murmurs died. Silence settled. No one shouted, "Free her!" No one jeered. The gathering did not demand she be released. They simply knelt to the weight of her resolve. Silas stood beside her, silent but unbowed. Eleanor felt the cold stone beneath her boots, the waning light on her cheeks, the steady warmth in Silas's grip. She felt fear still, but mingled now with clarity and purpose. The people turned away slowly, filing down the driveway, voices soft. Eleanor watched them depart until the last wagon's wheels kicked dust from the path. The manor gates closed behind them. In the quiet that followed, she and Silas stood alone. She let go of his hand for a moment and touched the stone banister, feeling the permanence of the place. Then she looked back at him, at the firelit windows of Blackridge behind, and whispered, "Thank you for giving me a choice." Silas inclined his head, expression unreadable but his eyes gentle. And in that pause between dusk and night, Eleanor Wade was no longer a transaction. She was a woman who had claimed her own life. The manor walls held echoes of judgment no more, only the beginning of something true. The wound was slight, just a bullet grazed through Silas's side, but it left him pale and weak. Eleanor hovered by his bedside, soothing his fever, pressing damp cloths to his forehead and softly coaxing him to sip thin broth. He winced with each shallow breath, but he would not curse or complain. She stayed at his side through every tremor, whispering his name and murmuring prayers she once hid in her heart. When morning broke and Silas sat upright without collapsing, Eleanor insisted he join her outside. The snow had finally melted from the fields, revealing the furrows beneath. The earth lay damp and dark, waiting. She found him at the barn's edge, his hand pressed to his side, leaning against a fence post for support. His face was drawn, the flesh paling. She stepped quietly to him. "Let me help," she said softly, voice trembling with concern. He nodded once, and together they gathered rotting planks from the barn's wall. Slowly, carefully, they pried loose the old wood and hammered in fresh boards. Eleanor handed nails and tools. Each time their hands brushed, a current passed through her, gentle, electric. Silas paused, locked eyes with her briefly, then nodded and continued, steadying a beam with visible effort. They moved on to the garden patch behind the house, where the soil lay cold but hopeful. Eleanor knelt beside him and traced shallow trenches with a stick, showing him where each row should be. He dug where she directed, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill. They planted handfuls of seeds, turnips, carrots, lettuce, lingering close, breathing in earth and light. Through the day, laughter trembled into existence, staccato, cautious, like birds returning after a long winter exile. A child from the nearby village wandered into the yard, curious. Eleanor paused and called her closer. She drew letters in the dirt and taught the child to read her name. Soon, more children gathered, tracing lines in the earth, timid giggles echoing across the fields. The once lonely halls of Blackridge now seemed to resonate with soft voices and fleeting cheer. At dusk, Eleanor stood on the porch with a watering can in her hands, the sky bleeding pink and gold across the hills. Silas came up behind her and gently took the can from her grasp. She turned slowly, heart too full. "Why did you say nothing when you took me?" she asked, voice low and fragile. He leaned against the rail, shoulders sagging with fatigue and pain. Wind lifted tufts of her hair, silence stretched between them. Finally, he spoke, voice quiet but firm. "Because I knew words would make it worse. You needed quiet to breathe." Her breath caught. She studied him in the waning light, the lines etched by pain, the set of his jaw, the way his wounded side rose with each inhale. In his eyes, she saw something more than duty or regret. She saw understanding. He had not taken her for power, not for pity. He had acted on empathy, on the recognition of the silent suffering she carried, the fear she bore, the longing to be seen. For the first time, she reached out without hesitation. Her fingers brushed his, then settled on his hand, warm, firm. He did not pull away. She held his hand and let silence speak between them. He turned his head, met her gaze with a soft intensity. In that moment she saw it all: regret, sorrow, resolve, love. Eleanor swallowed, voice trembling, but she said nothing. Words felt too fragile here. Instead, she allowed the stillness and the closeness to carry meaning. He squeezed her hand gently. Together, side by side, they watched over the small garden plot planted that day. The sprouts would come, the children would learn, the laughter would grow, In that quiet communion, Eleanor felt something shift. This was no longer mere survival. This was a rebirth. She no longer saw herself as traded or broken. She felt chosen, slowly and quietly, in this delicate season of renewal. Summer dawned over Blackridge, spilling warm gold across the hills. The manor's stone walls, once forbidding and cold, now gleamed in sunshine. Ivy climbed in fresh green over the gray, and birds sang in the eaves. Windows glowed with life instead of shadows. Eleanor stepped onto the veranda in the early light, drawing a quiet breath of hope. She and Silas walked hand in hand down the corridor to the locked door they long ago discovered. Today, the door stood open. They unlocked it together. Inside, the room felt peaceful, not oppressive. They had cleaned the dust, laid fresh drapes, and placed the box marked Mara on a pedestal. The locket, the journal, the photograph, all displayed respectfully, like relics of memory rather than secrets to hide. They invited the villagers to come see. Soft voices echoed in the chamber as people filed in. Eleanor stepped forward and addressed them. This was once a room of sorrow. My predecessor's pain sat in these walls. But now we open it, not to mourn alone, but to remember, to heal. She motioned to Mara's journal, now bound in new leather, placed under glass. The photograph, a portrait of a smiling woman in sunlit meadow, stood framed. Silas stood behind Eleanor, gently resting a hand on her waist. There was no shame in the display, just honesty. The villagers looked, some tears shining in eyes. They knew now this was no prison, but a place transformed. The cold fear was gone. In its place, a quiet reverence. As the crowd dispersed under a warm sky, Eleanor retreated to the study. She sat at a rough wooden desk and dipped a pen in ink. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. She wrote, "Once I was taken as a debt, but today I awaken in that very home as someone chosen." She sealed the letter and later gave it to a rider bound for the town below. She watched the horse depart, carrying her truth back to where it began. Later that afternoon, she and Silas mounted their horses. The fields stretched before them, wildflowers dancing in the breeze. They rode quietly side by side, their horses' hooves soft on the sun-warmed grass. They came to the small clearing where a stone marker stood, a gentle tomb for Mara. Around it they planted seeds of wild daisies and chrysanthemums. Eleanor held a handful of petals. Silas pressed a seed into the earth. Together they turned and walked slowly, hand in hand, leaving light footprints on the hill. Silas paused, drawing her close. He whispered, "You are home." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. Below them, the valley lay green and alive. Above them, the sky was wide and open. The wind carried no whispers of dread now. The echoes in the manor's halls had softened. Their past, their present, and their future stood together in one space, vulnerable, alive, healed. They mounted their horses again and rode down the slope, the sun dipping toward the horizon. Eleanor looked once more at Blackridge behind her. No shadows, no cages, no fear. Only home, only hope. And so the hill that once held ghosts now held love, memory, and new life. If this story stirred your heart, the quiet redemption, the love born not from grand gestures, but from silence and healing, then let us know by hitting that hype button. And if you want more tales of untamed hearts, dusty towns, and unforgettable romances on the frontier, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. We've got plenty more where this came from. See you on the next ride.